talking today to David Hyndman of NvTV. David, how did NvTV come to be set up?
Like all these kind of developments, it has a long sort of history to it. But it's particularly my history. Why does anybody start up, as it were, a television channel when there's so many TV channels going? But my roots go back to the 70s. And it was then I trained as a printer, actually as a compositor. But the technology changed, so they kind of let compositors kind of print in the small offset section. So I trained as a kind of compositor, small offset printer, and then decided with the politics of this place that I would start a free press, as they were described then, which was a free printing press, and began to print for all the community cultural groups in Belfast. And while we had the backdrop of the Troubles and so on.
So what sort of things were you printing?
Okay, also was the backdrop that Belfast was going through tremendous physical change, huge redevelopment in areas, all sorts of problems with youth, problems with housing. So what I was printing were community groups trying to grapple with the issue of redevelopment, how their communities were being literally destroyed by architects, and they were really battling to preserve the communities, to try and build houses that they could live in, to try and regenerate the communities. So I was at that period printing dozens of different types of community magazines. And kind of that, I realised that the issues that they were all bringing up wasn't really being covered by mainstream media. That they were all obviously directed by the things that were going on at the political level, or particularly the violence. But kind of that development, and I like to mention this because that development in itself was kind of released through a change in technology. And the change in technology at that time was from letterpress to small offset, in a sense. Although the large offset, small offset released the energies and creativity. Because what I used to do also, and it's saying all this because the same principles followed with video, but I used to encourage people to design their own newspapers.
It meant you didn't have to have necessarily a printer. You could engage with the technology yourself, couldn't you? All sorts of people who are no longer union people could, in a sense, get into producing stuff.
Traditionally, if you wanted printed material, you had to get a graphic designer or a compositor, which I was. But small offset allowed you to create magazines through typewriters, through taking photos and taking other magazines, making collages. It really was a cut and paste, cow gum, scalpel, where your kind of tools.
Make it yourself culture.
It was a do-it-yourself culture, and I would go around showing people how to do these things, and providing the tools for them. A little box at which they had the cow gum, the layout sheets, all the things you needed to create their magazines. So it's a kind of do-it-yourself, and then of course I would photograph and print them.
So how do we get from there to?
Okay, well, there was two things happened there. Well, first of all, the technology was changing, which allowed these magazines to be produced very cheaply and introduced people to do it yourself. And also, there was a need there. There was a clear need that they were not being heard, and this was the only way they could be heard, was doing it themselves. You had also, what followed on from that was a change in video technology. Because for the first time, in a sense, you had video being able to use by ordinary people. They could film stuff and they could see it back. So you had, at that time, being introduced the Sony Portapack. So I thought, well, this is a really great medium, very powerful medium. Television is a very powerful communication tool. Let's begin to use the Sony Portapack and see what we can do. And again, we engaged with people and started to make our own videos and so on, and realised that Yeah, it went along at a certain level, but one of the problems was a couple of problems. Technically, it wasn't very well developed, and editing films was a bit problematic, but the real problem was that we were producing these films, and when I say we, it was community groups and so on, but we couldn't get them shown in mainstream media. First of all, they said, well, you're technically inferior, you're going nowhere near us because you're using this stuff and it really is not broadcast standard. Of course, that was a valid argument, or so we thought, about what was applicable to be broadcast. But
it was also a bit like the print arguments, wasn't it? It was a way of holding out, from allowing people access to the media.
It was. I'm afraid television is a very pyramid-type structure, and it's very hard for ordinary people to begin to engage in programme making. And the traditional way of doing that still is that you would propose ideas through the commissioning process, and depending on the agenda of a commissioning editor, they would say, oh, well, we like this idea or we don't like this idea, but always in the mind of the people who wanted to make programmes was that agenda. So you had to conform to that agenda, and you had to conform to a particular way of making them. You had to make sure you had your director, your producer, all these kind of people who would help you realise your film, when in fact, in our terms, it can be just one person with the idea and going right through to the end, editing and finally transmitting. The traditional broadcast industry doesn't work that way. So what we were doing, we were producing these videos, and then came along the opportunity 5 or 6 years ago that there was a bit of spectrum left in the analogue signal, and we decided, well, we knew the limitations of that, very frustrating, the limitations, because it wouldn't reach everybody who we thought it would. We knew that from previous experience of local television producers.
So the coverage is what is
limited.
Yeah.
Depends on how good your aerial is, where you are in Belfast, the strength of our transmitter, and where our transmitter was. Particularly where your transmitter was, because it's very problematic in cities to ensure you get a site that is really top-notch. Very expensive because they tend to be owned by the broadcasters, the people who provide them with the services. So we took this up anyway because we felt, limited as it was, this would be some form of outlet for the work we were engaging in. And actually, limited it was, it proved absolutely correct, because during those 5 years, we and others were able to produce hundreds of programming. The traditional mainstream media would find it very problematic to produce.
So do you produce a 24-hour channel, or is it a limited number of hours a day?
Whenever we bid for the channel, we had previous experience of making programs, because we did make programs for Channel 4 and so on. But we realised actually it is quite difficult making programs, and that there's no good saying you're going to do 8 hours a day. We said, look, we'll do about 1.5 hours a day, and we'll repeat that throughout the day, because I think that's all we're capable of. And that's what we suggested. And looking at other people, they suggested all sorts of fanciful ideas, but we knew from experience that was a really good goal to do that. So that's what we have presently, about 1.5 hours. And it depends very much on the kind of level of funding and so on. The problem is there's no dedicated funding to community media of any sort. So what tends to happen is that the programmes are put on as a result of processes that we engage in. They're not funding per se.
Yeah, funding for other things, as it were.
Yes.
And what's the audience size? Do you have a sense of that?
That's very problematic. Initially, when we started broadcasting, all we could ever do was just say, do you ever watch the programme, and so on. They have no way of measuring it. Even in the Ofcom report, which is looking for more local television throughout the UK, it's saying, well, we know you can't measure it. There isn't the traditional ways of measuring it. All you can measure it by is results. If you put an ad on, will people go to that shop and so on, unless you asked everybody in the street.
So do you carry advertising?
No, we never found that we had the robustness that would
it was difficult to answer the audience question.
The problem we were faced with is that advertisers would say to us, but not everybody can receive your picture. We knew that because the signal that we were given and so on was so poor, so we didn't have that confidence to say, right, off we go, we can sell advertising. So what we have tended to do, in a sense, is do community programming, paid for through the processes, and that kind of developed other areas that we'd like to have done.
And give me a couple of examples of the kinds of programs that show.
Well, what I just finished editing was a chap, we didn't make it, a chap made a film about interfaces in terms of Protestant Catholic communities and how they deal with the problems. And so he made the film, and I thought it'd be good to kind of get an insight from him about why he made the film, what were the problems and so on. So that was one show. Other shows can be about artists who tell the history of their work and so on. It really is, huge range of programming.
And have you had programs that have been particularly successful?
Well, when you say successful, how do you gauge that? One thing I found was, from the feedback, is that one thing may appeal to some people and really mean something to them, and you may put huge production values into other things and you don't get as much feedback. It's a kind of analogy is a bit like music, people go for the popular music, but they'll always go for those songs which mean something to them. So it's very varied, but what we have is like a broad church, and the beauty is that we don't have to conform to populist notions of what may be successful. It's kind of like an education.
It's like public TV in a way.
Well, public TV...
Public interest TV, maybe.
Public interest TV, because public TV, which the BBC, public service broadcasting, have within that kind of framework still the responsibility to ensure they have a fairly substantial audience. And that's kind of the paradox. On one hand, they want to do interesting broadcasting, on the other hand, they have to have a mass audience for it. And we don't. We kind of can do things that have very small audiences.
And what will happen when television goes digital? Will you get a digital channel out of that process and get a slightly better transmission area?
Throughout our process of local television, in the end, we kind of emerged as, throughout the UK, as the only group who carried on the analogue process. But during that time, we lobbied very hard that this could be a lot better. Local television was an important area. It could be strategically important throughout the UK. So at every opportunity we said, why don't you have local TV throughout the UK? And the Labour government were kind of hemming and hawing, but the Conservatives came in and said, okay, Jeremy Hunt said, we're going to make this happen. And he did. He is now providing the infrastructural support through BBC, paying for the transmitters, the places to put them up and so on. He's also suggesting that the BBC should pay for some of the content. And these are two great... The problem we had is distribution. Everybody must receive it, and that is going to be solved because he's putting all the money into the infrastructure. So right now, people are applying for the licenses. I think there's 12 or 13 cities they're starting with to go over to have their local channel carried on Freeview as well as satellite and NTL. So,
and will Belfast be one of those cities?
Absolutely, yeah. I think after all that work that we'd be included, and Belfast is included, so we're presently putting together a bid to try and get our service on Freeview. It would mean a kind of change for us, because it would mean finally when people turn their TV on, they'll get a pristine picture, and therefore we'll be able to go into other areas in advertising and so on to pay for other sorts of programming.
Dave, thanks for talking to me today.
Thank you very much.